She bought a ghost town saloon for 25 cents at a county auction, where seasoned land barons and mining investors stood with bulging wallets, watching her place a bid that should have sparked a fierce bidding war. But not a single person raised their hand to compete, and the way they looked at her, with something between dread and mourning, told Evangeline Rose Hartley she'd just purchased more than an abandoned building in the middle of nowhere. The November wind howled through the open windows of the Silverton County courthouse, carrying the scent of approaching snow. Evangeline had traveled 4 days by train and stagecoach from St. Louis after spotting the auction notice in a territorial newspaper, a complete saloon building in the ghost town of Whispering Pines, starting bid of 25 cents. At 28 years old, Evangeline had spent the last decade working as a bookkeeper in her late father's freight company, saving every spare penny. When her brother inherited the business and promptly gambled it away, she'd decided to head west and start fresh. A saloon building, even in a ghost town, could be dismantled and sold for lumber. The 2 acres of land it sat on might be worth something to a rancher. The auctioneer, a portly man with mutton chop whiskers, who'd introduced himself as Cornelius Pike, was moving through properties with practiced efficiency. Evangeline waited patiently, studying the dozen or so men scattered throughout the courthouse. Prospectors, ranchers, land speculators, all the usual types who attended such auctions. Next item, Pike announced, his voice filling the high-ceilinged room, the Silver Spur Saloon, located in the abandoned township of Whispering Pines. Structure is approximately 40 years old, solid timber construction, 2 stories, sitting on 2 full acres. Starting bid is 25 cents. Evangeline's hand shot up before anyone else could move. 25 cents. The effect was immediate and unsettling. Every conversation in the room died mid-sentence. Pike's hand froze halfway to his gavel. A woman near the back, Evangeline would later learn she was Miriam Blackwood, the widow of Whispering Pines' last sheriff, actually gasped audibly. "Ma'am," Pike said slowly, "perhaps you'd like to reconsider. There are other properties on today's." "I bid 25 cents, Evangeline repeated firmly. Her father had taught her never to show uncertainty in a business negotiation. Pike's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. "Going once for 25 cents to the lady in the blue traveling dress." A weathered prospector with a grizzled beard leaned toward his companion and said, just loud enough for Evangeline to hear, "Damn shame, she seems like a decent sort." "Going twice," Pike continued, his voice now barely above a whisper. Evangeline glanced around the room, confused by the reactions. A tall man in an expensive coat and silver bolo tie was staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not greed or jealousy, something closer to pity mixed with genuine concern. He started to raise his hand, perhaps to make a counterbid, but the man beside him grabbed his wrist and shook his head firmly. The gavel came down with a crack that echoed like a gunshot in the suddenly silent courthouse. "Sold to the lady in blue for 25 cents. May God have mercy." That last phrase was spoken so quietly that Evangeline almost missed it, but she definitely noticed what happened next. The mass exodus. Within 3 minutes, the courthouse had emptied as if someone had announced a fire. People practically fled through the doors, not even bothering to wait for the remaining properties to be auctioned. Evangeline approached Pike's table, her small purse in hand. "I have the 25 cents right here, Mr. Pike." The auctioneer wouldn't meet her eyes as he prepared the deed. His hands shook so badly, he smeared ink across the paper twice and had to start over. "Miss Hartley, I'm required to ask, do you have family in the territory?" Someone who should be notified of your whereabouts. I'm quite capable of taking care of myself, thank you. I'm sure you are. Pike finally looked up, and Evangeline was startled to see genuine fear in his eyes. But that place, Whispering Pines, there are stories. Old stories about what happened there in '91. Ghost stories. Evangeline asked, with a slight smile. I don't put much stock in superstition, Mr. Pike. It's not ghosts you need to worry about, miss. It's the living. He pushed the deed across the table with trembling fingers. You own it legally now. That's all I can say. But if you're wise, you'll resell it immediately and never set foot in that town. If it's so terrible, why didn't anyone else bid? Surely someone could have bought it just to tear it down. Pike was already gathering his papers, preparing to leave despite the auction being incomplete. Because some things are better left alone, Miss Hartley. Some secrets should stay buried. He left without another word, abandoning his auctioneer's gavel on the table. Evangeline stood alone in the empty courthouse, holding a deed to property that had somehow terrified an entire room full of hardened frontier men. She walked to the window and looked out at the street. Her stomach dropped. At least 15 people were standing in groups along the boardwalk, pretending to conduct business or examine shop windows. But they were all watching the courthouse, watching her. An elderly woman in widow's weeds, Miriam Blackwood, stood nearest. When she caught Evangeline's eye, she slowly shook her head and mouthed 2 words, "Turn back." But Evangeline Rose Hartley hadn't traveled 2,000 miles to turn back because of vague warnings and superstitious nonsense. She squared her shoulders, tucked the deed into her traveling bag, and walked out of the courthouse with her head held high. As she passed Miriam Blackwood, the older woman grabbed her arm with surprising strength. "Child, listen to me. 3 people have bought that property in the last 30 years. All 3 disappeared within a week of taking possession. The law ruled them missing, but everyone knows what really happened." "And what really happened?" Evangeline asked, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. Miriam leaned close, her breath smelling of peppermint and fear. "They found what was hidden, and someone made sure they never told anyone about it." Before Evangeline could ask more, Miriam released her arm and hurried away, leaving Evangeline standing alone on the boardwalk with her 25-cent purchase and a growing sense that she'd made a terrible mistake. The journey to Whispering Pines took Evangeline through the most desolate landscape she'd ever seen. She'd hired a guide, a taciturn half-Navajo tracker named Standing Bear, who'd agreed to take her only after she'd offered him triple his usual rate. Even then, he'd looked at her as if she were riding toward her own funeral. They traveled for 6 hours through increasingly barren terrain. The road became a trail, then barely a suggestion through scrub brush and red rock formations that looked like ancient ruins. They passed the remains of other abandoned mining settlements, Desolation Creek, Fortune's End, Last Hope, all living up to their names with collapsed buildings and empty mine shafts like dead eyes staring from the hillsides. But when they crested the final ridge and Whispering Pines came into view, Evangeline understood why this place was different. The other ghost towns looked like they'd been defeated by time and hardship. Whispering Pines looked like it had been abandoned mid-breath, as if everyone had simply vanished while going about their daily business. Buildings stood straight and solid. The church steeple rose toward the sky, its bell still hanging in place. Fences remained upright. Even the main street's wooden boardwalk appeared intact. "This is as far as I go," Standing Bear announced, pulling his horse to a stop. "I'll wait here until sunset. If you're not back by then, I'm leaving." "That's not what we agreed. That was before I saw this place up close again." The guide's weathered face was grim. My grandfather told stories about whispering pines. He said the spirits here are angry, that blood soaked into this ground and poisoned it. I didn't believe him until I came here 5 years ago, tracking a man who'd gone missing, found his horse wandering loose, but never found him. What do you think happened to him? She was standing bare, looked directly at her. Same thing that happens to everyone who comes here, asking too many questions. Someone made sure he stopped asking. He gestured toward the town. The Silver Spur is the big building in the center. You'll know it when you see it. Be back here before dark, Miss Hartley. Please. Evangeline nodded and urged her horse down the slope toward Whispering Pines. The town was eerily silent, except for the wind whistling through broken windows and the creak of loose boards. Her horse's hooves echoed on the wooden boardwalk as she rode down the main street, past the general store with goods still visible on dusty shelves, past the assayer's office with its scale still sitting on the counter, past residences with curtains hanging in the windows. And then she saw it, the Silver Spur Saloon. It dominated the center of town, a massive 2-story structure built from the best timber money could buy. Unlike the cabin-like construction of other buildings, the Silver Spur had been designed to impress, with carved columns supporting a covered porch, large windows with decorative trim, and double doors made of solid oak, with brass handles that still gleamed dully in the afternoon sun. Above the doors, faded letters proclaimed, Silver Spur Saloon, established 1882, Whiskey Games Accommodations. Evangeline dismounted and tied her horse to the hitching rail, which stood solid despite 3 decades of weather. She stood for a moment, studying the building. From the outside, it looked ready to open for business tomorrow, but there was something wrong about it, something she couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was too perfect, too untouched by time. Or perhaps it was the way the afternoon shadows seemed to gather around the building more darkly than around the other structures. She climbed the 3 steps to the porch. The boards didn't creak, they felt solid beneath her boots. She reached for the brass door handles and found them cool to the touch, surprisingly free of the tarnish that should have accumulated over 30 years. The doors swung open smoothly, as if someone had kept the hinges oiled. Inside, Evangeline stopped and stared in amazement. The saloon looked like it had been frozen in time. A magnificent mahogany bar stretched along the left wall, its surface still glossy beneath a layer of fine dust. Behind it, 3 tiers of shelves held dozens of bottles, whiskey, gin, brandy, wine, all still sealed and full. But it was the walls that caught Evangeline's attention and made her blood run cold. Bullet holes. Dozens of them, concentrated in specific areas around the bar, near the staircase leading to the 2nd floor, and clustered around the piano. These weren't random shots from drunken revelry. The groupings were tight, professional. This had been a gunfight between people who knew how to shoot. And there was something else. Dark stains on the wooden floor in several places. Stains that looked suspiciously like old bloodstains, faded but still visible. Evangeline moved deeper into the room, her practical boots echoing on the solid floorboards. Behind the bar, she found more evidence of sudden abandonment. A ledger lay open, the last entry dated June 15th, 1891. Received payment for rooms 4 and 5, $2. Total daily take, $47.35. The handwriting was neat, precise, a bookkeeper's hand, much like her own. She was about to close the ledger when something caught her eye. The bar's back wall, where the bottles were displayed on their shelves, didn't quite match the rest of the room. The wood grain ran in a slightly different direction, and there were hairline gaps in the paneling that suggested it had been removed and replaced. Evangeline's father had taught her about hidden compartments. Freight companies often built them into offices to store valuable documents or cash. She began examining the wall more carefully, running her fingers along the edges of the panels. Then she found it, a knothole in the wood at shoulder height, worn smooth as if someone had pressed it repeatedly. When she pushed it, she heard a soft mechanical click, and a section of the wall swung inward on hidden hinges. Behind the false panel was a cavity about 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall, built into the wall's framing. Inside was a leather document case, the kind lawyers and bankers used, remarkably well preserved despite the decades. Evangeline lifted it out carefully. It was heavier than she expected, and she could feel the weight of multiple items inside. Her hands trembled slightly as she set it on the bar and unbuckled the brass clasps. The case fell open, revealing contents that made her heart race. A thick ledger bound in expensive leather, with gold accounts private embossed on the cover in faded gilt lettering. A detailed territorial map, hand-drawn with meticulous care, marked with at least 40 X symbols and extensive notations in tiny, precise handwriting. A collection of yellowed newspapers from June and July 1891, all covering variations of the same headline: Dalton Gang Vanishes After Fort Griffin Bank Robbery and Notorious Outlaws. Escape with $2.30 million in gold bullion. And at the bottom of the case, a stack of photographs, tintype images of hard-faced men in cowboy attire, each labeled with a name and date. Evangeline's hands shook as she opened the gold ledger. The first page was written in the same neat handwriting as the Saloon's daily accounts. Private accounts of the Dalton Gang operations, January 1889, June 1891, compiled by Victoria Dalton, gang accountant. Total gold acquired, $2,347,000, total distributed to cash locations, $2,290, 000 reserve for emergency, $57,000, held at Silver Spur status. Final accounting before disbandment. Evangeline's breath. Court. Victoria Dalton. The Dalton gang had included a woman, something she'd never read in any newspaper accounts. And that woman had been keeping meticulous financial records of one of the West's most notorious outlaw gangs. The next pages contained detailed entries. March 12, 1889, Santa Rosa Bank, New Mexico Territory. Gold bars, $47,000, cached at Red Canyon, location #3. August 3, 1889, Silver Valley Mining Company, payroll, gold coins, $23,000, cached at Eagle's Nest location #7 December 17, 1890, Fort Griffin Bank, Texas gold bullion, $180,000, divided between locations #12, #15, and #18. Page after page of robberies, with precise amounts, dates, and most importantly, detailed maps and descriptions of where the stolen gold had been hidden. Evangeline's mathematical mind quickly calculated the total. If even half of these caches remained undiscovered after 30 years, they would be worth. Her hands trembled as she did the math. At least $15 million at current gold prices, perhaps as much as $38 million if all the locations were still intact. She had just found a treasure map to one of the largest outlaw fortunes in Western history. A shadow moved across the window. Evangeline's head snapped up. Through the dusty glass, she could see a figure on horseback, positioned on the ridge overlooking the town. The rider was making no attempt to hide. In fact, they seemed to want to be seen. As Evangeline watched, the rider removed their hat in a slow, deliberate gesture. Even from this distance, she could see it was a black hat with a distinctive silver band that caught the sunlight. The rider held the hat up for a long moment, as if making sure Evangeline got a good look, then replaced it and turned their horse away at a leisurely pace, disappearing over the ridge. But Evangeline had seen enough. That same silver-banded black hat had been worn by the tall man in the expensive coat at the auction, the one who'd started to bid against her before being stopped by his companion. Someone had been watching this saloon, watching it for years, perhaps decades, waiting for someone to finally claim the property legally and discover what was hidden inside. The question that made Evangeline's blood run cold was, how many people knew about Victoria Dalton's ledger, and what had happened to the previous 3 people who'd bought this property and disappeared? She looked down at the leather-bound ledger in her hands. Inside were the locations of approximately 40 gold caches containing over $2 million in stolen bullion and coins, equivalent to perhaps $38 million in modern currency. She'd bought a ghost town saloon for 25 cents, but she'd inherited a secret that people had been protecting and killing for since 1891. Outside, the sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, casting long shadows through the abandoned town. Evangeline carefully closed the gold ledger and tucked it into her traveling bag, along with the map and newspapers. As she did, she heard something that made her freeze, the sound of multiple horses approaching from the direction of the ridge. Not hurrying but moving with purpose. At least 3 riders, maybe more. Someone had been watching her discover the ledger, and now they were coming. Evangeline grabbed the leather document case and ran for the door. She had perhaps 10 minutes before the riders reached the town, 10 minutes to get back to Standing Bear and safety. As she burst through the saloon doors into the fading afternoon light, one thought echoed through her mind with terrible clarity. She finally understood why no one had bid against her at the auction. They hadn't been afraid of the property. They'd been afraid for her. Part 2. She bought a ghost town saloon for 25 cents, then found an Outlaws gold ledger worth $38 million. Part 2. Justice and Redemption Final. Previously, Evangeline Rose Hartley bought a ghost town saloon for 25 cents and discovered Victoria Dalton's hidden ledger containing the locations of $38 million in stolen outlaw gold. Now riders are approaching, and she's running for her life. Evangeline sprinted toward her horse as the sound of approaching riders grew louder. She'd nearly reached Standing Bear's position on the ridge when 3 horsemen emerged from behind the older sire's office, cutting off her escape route. The lead rider was the tall man from the auction, the one with the silver-banded hat. Up close, his features were sharp and calculating. "Miss Hartley," he called out, his voice surprisingly cultured. "I'm Theodore Ashworth. We need to talk about what you found in that saloon." Evangeline's hand moved to the pistol in her traveling bag, her father's old Colt revolver. "Stay back. I'm not here to hurt you." Ashworth raised his hand slowly. "I'm here to save your life. That ledger you're carrying has already gotten 3 people killed. You'll be the 4th unless you listen to me. Why should I trust you? Because I've been protecting that saloon for 27 years, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to finally claim it legally." He dismounted carefully, his hands still visible. "My name is Theodore Ashworth. I'm a Pinkerton detective, and I've been investigating the Dalton gang since 1891. Before Evangeline could respond, another group of riders appeared from the opposite direction. At least 6 men, led by none other than Cornelius Pike, the auctioneer. But Pike looked different now, harder, more dangerous. He carried a rifle across his saddle. "Step away from her, Ashworth," Pike commanded. "That ledger belongs to people far more powerful than some washed-up detective." Ashworth positioned himself between Evangeline and Pike's men. "It belongs to the banks and mining companies it was stolen from. Cornelius, you know that." Pike laughed bitterly. "Those banks were reimbursed by insurance 30 years ago. That gold has no rightful owner anymore. Finders keepers." "That's where you're wrong," a new voice called out. Everyone turned to see Miriam Blackwood riding into the clearing, accompanied by an older gentleman in a marshal's uniform. "That gold is evidence in multiple murder investigations, and Miss Hartley just became the key witness." The marshal, a weathered man with steel-grey hair, moved his horse forward. "I'm Marshal William Garrett, Territorial Law. Mr. Pike, you and your associates are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and theft of federal property." Pike's hand moved toward his rifle. "You're outnumbered, Garrett." "Actually, he's not," Standing Bear said quietly, emerging from cover with a Winchester rifle. Behind him, 4 more men appeared, all wearing deputy badges. Marshal Garrett had been waiting for this moment. "We've been watching this saloon for months, waiting to see who would make a move once someone finally bought it." Miss Hartley's purchase forced everyone's hand. Evangeline's mind raced. "You knew what was hidden there." "We suspected," Garrett admitted. "Victoria Dalton disappeared in June 1891, the same day the gang disbanded. Her brother, the gang's leader, was shot 2 weeks later while trying to retrieve the ledger. Before he died, he told a doctor there was evidence hidden in Whispering Pines that could lead to all their stolen gold." Miriam Blackwood spoke up, her voice trembling. "My husband was the sheriff of Whispering Pines. He found Victoria's ledger and tried to use it to recover the stolen gold and return it to its rightful owners. They killed him for it, made it look like he'd abandoned his post." She looked at Pike with pure hatred. "You were one of them, Cornelius. You were always one of them." Pike's face had gone pale. "I was protecting my investment. That gold was my ticket out of this god-forsaken territory." "It was blood money," Garrett said coldly, "and you killed 3 innocent people trying to get it. The previous buyers of that saloon, all murdered on your orders." Ashworth added, "I've spent nearly 3 decades gathering evidence against the syndicate that formed after the Dalton gang disbanded. Local officials, businessmen, even some lawmen, all trying to claim that stolen gold for themselves. Victoria Dalton's ledger is the final piece we needed." Evangeline slowly pulled the leather-bound ledger from her bag. "There are 40 cash locations marked here. Nearly $2.3 million in gold, possibly worth $38 million today, most of which belongs to banks, mining companies, and families who were ruined by those robberies," Garrett explained. "With that ledger, we can finally recover what was stolen and return it to the rightful owners or their descendants." Pike made his move, reaching for his rifle. But Standing Bear was faster. A single shot rang out, and Pike's weapon flew from his hands. Within moments, Garrett's deputies had surrounded Pike's men, disarming them efficiently. As Pike was being placed in handcuffs, he spat toward Evangeline. "You stupid woman. You could have been rich beyond your wildest dreams." "I'd rather be honest," Evangeline replied quietly. 3 months later, Evangeline stood in the Silverton County courthouse, the same building where she'd bought the Silver Spur Saloon for 25 cents. But this time, she wasn't buying property. She was accepting a reward. Marshal Garrett read from an official document. "By order of the Territorial Governor and the United States Marshal Service, Miss Evangeline Rose Hartley is hereby awarded 15% of all recovered gold as a finder's fee, in recognition of her courage and cooperation in the recovery operation." Theodore Ashworth had used Victoria Dalton's meticulous records to locate 37 of the 40 cache sites. They'd recovered $2.1 million in gold bullion and coins, worth nearly $36 million at current prices. After accounting for legal fees and distribution to victims, Evangeline's share came to $5.4 million. But more importantly, the evidence in the ledger had exposed a corruption network that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. 17 officials were arrested, including 2 judges and a territorial senator. The syndicate that had killed to protect the Dalton gold was finally destroyed. Cornelius Pike and his associates were sentenced to life imprisonment for murder and conspiracy. Miriam Blackwood finally learned the truth about her husband's death and saw his killers brought to justice. As for Evangeline, she used her reward money to establish the Victoria Dalton Memorial Bank, a women-owned financial institution dedicated to helping female entrepreneurs in the frontier territories. She also purchased the town of Whispering Pines and began restoration, determined to give the ghost town new life as a place of legitimate business rather than criminal enterprise. The Silver Spur Saloon was transformed into a museum, with Victoria Dalton's story as its centerpiece, the brilliant but misguided woman who kept the books for Outlaws but ultimately provided the evidence that brought down the criminal empire that succeeded them. Theodore Ashworth retired from the Pinkerton Agency and became the museum's curator, finally able to tell the full story of his 27-year investigation. Sometimes, late at night, Evangeline would walk through the restored saloon and think about the chain of events that started with a 25-cent bid. She'd thought she was buying abandoned property to salvage for lumber money. Instead, she'd purchased the key to justice for dozens of families, the evidence that dismantled a corrupt syndicate, and the means to honor a woman whose story had been buried for 3 decades. The 25 cents had been the best investment she'd ever made, not because of the gold, but because it revealed her own courage when it mattered most. She was no longer just Evangeline Rose Hartley, the bookkeeper from St. Louis, just Evangeline Rose Hartley, the bookkeeper from St. She was Evangeline Rose Hartley, banker, entrepreneur, and the woman who'd helped bring justice to the victims of the Dalton gang, and that was worth far more than all the outlaw gold in the territory. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through the Old West. If you enjoyed this tale of courage, corruption, and justice, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more amazing frontier stories. Share this video with anyone who loves tales of ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary situations and chose to do the right thing. Your support means everything and helps us bring you these captivating true stories every week.